Hi, my name is Christiana Kafori, and I'm doing my spotlight presentation on Jerome Seymour Bruner. He was an American psychologist who made significant contributions to human cognitive psychology and cognitive learning theory in educational psychology. Jerome Bruner died at the astonishing age of 100 this past June. He has lived a remarkable life, and this spotlight will only skim the many accomplishments and significant contributions he has made that has attributed to so much research and scholarly work. Bruner conducted much of his narrative inquiry and development in the 1980s. Bruner was born in New York City to parents Herman and Rose Bruner, who were Polish Jewish immigrants. His father died of cancer when Bruner was only 12 years old. An interesting fact that Bruner shared in his interview that he conducted in March of 2007 was that he was born blind and only regained his sight after an operation to remove his cataracts when he was 2 years old. He doesn't have any real recollection of those early years. However, he does state that there must have been a lasting effect. It's not the worst thing in the world to have a vision of your parents that you have created for yourself, but there is still a large sensory deprivation. And then he goes on to state that there must have been a longing for attachment that went partially unfulfilled. Bruner received a BA in 1937 from Duke University and a PhD from Harvard University in 1941. According to a review of General Psychology survey that was published in 2002, they ranked Bruner as the 28th most cited psychologist of the 20th century. He was on the faculty department of psychology at Harvard University from 1952 through 72. And in 1960, Bruner published The Process of Education. This book led to much experimentation and a wide range of educational programs in the 60s. Howard Gardner, other young researchers worked under Bruner and were very influenced by his work. In the early 70s, Bruner left Harvard to teach at the University of Oxford for several years, and then returned to Harvard in 79 and was senior researcher in the New York University School of Law. Bruner had several major areas of study he contributed to. Bruner is one of the pioneers to cognitive psychology in the U.S., which began through his own early research on sensation and perception as being active rather than passive processes. In 1956, Bruner published the book A Study of Thinking, which formally introduced the study of cognitive psychology. Soon after, Bruner helped fund the Harvard Center of Cognitive Studies. And then in 1990, Bruner published the book of Acts of Meaning. It's called Acts of Meaning, where he defied the computer model for studying the mind, advocating for a more holistic understanding of the mind and its cognitions. Beginning around 1967, Bruner turned his attention to the study of developmental psychology and studied the way children learn. He devised the term scaffolding to describe the way children often build on the information they have already mastered. While Bruner was at Harvard, he published a series of works about his assessment of current educational systems and ways that education could improve. In 1961, he published the book Process of Education. Bruner also served as a member of the educational panel for the President's Science Advisory Committee during the presidencies of both Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. In 1966, Bruner published another book relevant to education, Towards a Theory of Instruction. And in 1973, another book, The Relevance of Education, and another in 1996, The Culture of Education. Bruner re-examined the state of educational practice around 3 decades after he began his educational research. Bruner was also credited with helping fund the Head Start Early Child Care program. And in 1995, Bruner made a visit to the preschools of Reggio Emilia and has established a collaborative relationship with them to improve educational systems internationally. In 1972, Bruner was appointed Watts Professor of Experimental Psychology at the University of Oxford. He remained there until 1980, and then during that time, he studied language development. Following Vygotsky's theoretical approach to social-cultural developments, Bruner proposed that social interaction plays a fundamental role in the development of cognition and of language in particular. He stressed that children learn language in order to communicate, and at the same time, they also learn the linguistic code. And then Bruner enters into the world of narrative. In 1980, Bruner returned to the U.S., taking up position as professor of the New School of Social Research in New York City. For the next decade, he worked on the development of a theory of narrative construction of reality, culminating in several seminal publications. His book, Actual Minds, Possible Worlds, was cited scholarly publications with well over 16,000 times, making it one of the most influential works of the 20th century. Bruner concerned himself with the function of narrative, or quote-unquote storytelling, as a way of mediating or creating a context for information. And in the creation of culturally characteristic folk psychology, he collaborated with law professor Anthony Amsterdam in explaining the role of narrative and rhetoric in the shaping of legal cases. Bruner speaks of narrative in his 2007 interview with John Crace, stating, "Why are we so intellectually dismissive towards narrative?" he asks. "Why are we inclined to treat it as a rather trashy, if entertaining way of thinking about and talking about what we do with our minds? Storytelling performs the dual cultural function of making strange familiar and ourselves private and distinctive." Bruner was one of the founding fathers of the constructivist theory. His theoretical framework is based on the theme that learners construct new ideas or concepts based upon existing knowledge, and learning is an active process. Eventually, Bruner was strongly influenced by Vygotsky's writings and began to turn away from his intrapersonal focus he had for learning and began to gravitate more towards a social and political view of learning. His views are also very similar to those of Piaget, but he places more highlighting on the social influences of development. Bruner also incorporated Darwinian thinking into his basic assumptions about learning. He believed it was necessary to refer to human culture and primate evolution in order to understand growth and development. And his book, The Culture of Education, reflected these changes in his viewpoints since the 1960s, and adopted the point of view that culture shapes the mind and provides the raw material with which we limit our world and our self-perceptions. Bruner has extensive amount of publications. I chose just a few to horn in on for narrative purposes. One being The Narrative Construction of Reality, which I believe we end up reading in this class. Jerome Bruner points out that for a long time, science and scientists have attempted to produce an explanation of human behavior. And it wasn't until recently that two main opposing views, which were rationalism and empiricism, which is what she kind of goes back and forth through, comparing that to the, where he further explains that lately the social constructivist approach became influential. He talks about information and experience stemming from social interaction, and it's organized in narrative form, which is judged in terms of plausible or not instead of correct or false. And he talks a little bit about that, how the empirical tend to gear more towards correct or false, where the narrative, it's truth, it's reality, it happened. Bruner considers narrative thought and discourse to be closely related and doesn't discriminate between the two. Narratives are not only a form of describing, but also a form of constructing and understanding reality. Another And at one point he does state, that there are specific domains of human knowledge and skill that are supported and organized by cultural toolkits, quote unquote. Another publication is a chapter entitled Life as a Narrative. The importance of this narrative is Bruner's practices experimental psychology. He analyzes the life stories of this family, which is a mother, a father, a son, and a daughter, and the process of demonstrating how a literary look at the everyday language gives us new understanding of the phrase a well-examined life. So what Bruner proposes is that the ways of telling and the ways of conceptualizing both so habitual that they finally become recipes for structuring experience itself, for laying down routes into memory, and for not only guiding the life narrative up to the present, but directing it into the future, unquote, page 708. He goes on to explain that if we are to understand people's narratives, we need to understand how they deliver those narratives. Another publication is The Autobiographical Process, where Bruner emphasizes that an autobiography is not and cannot be a way of suggesting or referring to a life as lived. He takes the approach that there is no such thing as life as lived, but referred to. In this view, he states, quote, "A life is created or constructed by the act of autobiography, and it is a way of construing experience, reconstruing it until our breath or our pen fails us." And lastly is the book Actual Minds, Possible Worlds. It's described as drawing on recent work in literary theory, linguistics, and symbolic anthropology, as well as cognitive and developmental psychology. Bruner examines the mental acts that enter into the imaginative creation of possible worlds, and he shows how the activity of imaginary world making undergirds human science, literature, and philosophy, as well as in everyday thinking, and even our sense of self. So this is pretty interesting. More insight on Jerome Bruner. Is the spiral curriculum. He introduced the ideas of readiness or learning and spiral curriculum. Bruner believed that any subject could be taught at any stage of development in a way that adequately adhered to the child's cognitive abilities. Spiral curriculum refers to the idea of revisiting basic ideas repeatedly, building upon them, and expanding to the level of full understanding and mastery. I recommend Bruner. I am quite partial to Bruner's work in the field of educational psychology and development, in particular his research inquiry in the social means of child development and learning. Jerome Bruner is more than a psychologist and prominent scholarly author in the field of psychological, cognitive, and educational development. In the 100 years of his life, he made a tremendous impact in the study of humans, the mind and body, that his legacy will live on forever. And that is the end of my presentation. I've included an extensive selected biography, and thank you.